pick up on.
Brenda and Benjamin, it's nice to meet you both.
Nice.
Okay, so basically just to welcome and forget the rest, right, Muhammad Al-Ghamdi? Okay, welcome all to the digital meeting of electronic games, one of think tank tech initiative programs in partnership with this Saudi Federation of Electronic Sports in the season of Gamers Without Borders. So with you today is Mohammed Siyar. I work for EY and I'm going to be the moderator for today. And let me start with first thanking Think Tech team, MCIT in general, and Gamers Without Borders for creating this opportunity for all of us to give something back to the Saudi Arabia country and also the community. Second, let me welcome and thank you all of you for joining us today. And let me start with a big welcome also to our panel members, Dr. Brenda joining us from San Diego, Dr. Ali joining us. I think I will kick off the meeting now, and we'll start with making a quick intro. And then first of all, I want to welcome all to the digital meetings of electronic games, one of Think Tech initiative programs in partnership with the Saudi Federation of Electronic Sports in this season of Gamers Without Borders. First of all, let me just give a very quick intro and of myself, and then we'll kick off. My name is Mohammed Siyar. I work for Ernst & Young. I lead our digital government agenda in the Middle East region, and I'm very much looking forward to playing the moderator role on this amazing panel. Thank you, Think Tech team and Ministry of Communication and Information Technology in general, and Gamers Without Borders for creating this opportunity for all of us to give something back to Saudi Arabia and the community. And also welcome to all of you who have joined us today, and thank you for taking some time out to be with us. And a big welcome to our panel members, Dr. Brenda joining us from San Diego, and Dr. Ali joining us from Dayton, Ohio today, and Benjamin joining us from Europe. And a big thank you to all of you. I really appreciate you taking some time out of your busy schedules to support us with this session today. Now, I want to, before we go into the discussion, just really very quickly set the context. And we all hear about video games, and whilst there are many negative things we hear about it, there are also tremendous social benefits that can be drawn from them. And whether it is about learning and development benefits, health benefits, or social benefits, there are many for us to gain from. And that's going to be the main focus of our session today. What are the benefits of video gaming from a social perspective? So before kicking off, just want to very quickly talk through how the session will be structured. We'll kick off with a very brief introduction from each one of the panel members, and we'll also hear their opening perspective on social power of video games. We'll then move into a Q&A discussion. I have some questions of my own to ask for, but would very much like you guys to also, who are attending, to post your questions in the chat, and we'll be trying to pick them up and answer all of them. Also, I would encourage each of the panel members to feel free to post questions and add on the responses of other panel members. I would very much like this session really to be very casual, informal as possible. In fact, if it's where we are sitting around, a coffee table and having a cup of coffee and having a chat, because I believe that really will give true value to all of you in hearing the thoughts and views of our panel members. And finally, at the end of, as we're closing, I will ask each one of our esteemed panel members to share their closing thoughts before I conclude and bring the session to a close. Okay, so let's get started. Today, as mentioned earlier, we are privileged to have with us an amazing panel, all of whom, in my eyes, and I'm sure in yours, are not just experts in their chosen fields, but celebrities in their own right. And between them, they cover a diverse set of dimensions when it comes to social benefits of video games. So for one, I'm really looking forward to hearing their thoughts and views and insights that they will be sharing with us today. So let's kick off. If I can first start with Dr. Brenda, if you don't mind, please take a couple of minutes to 3 minutes to introduce yourself, and please also share with us your perspective on the social power of video games based on your respective area of expertise.
Absolutely. And first off, thank you very much for the opportunity to be part of your Congress today. I appreciate the opportunity to share with everyone my 20-year journey I've had with virtual reality and video games and some of the positive things I've seen. I am a licensed clinical psychologist in both the US and Europe, and I have developed and validated virtual reality and video game worlds for treatment, therapy, training, and education for the past 20 years. And I've also opened clinics. And I've done that in Europe, in China, and in the US. And the reason that is very important is as we look at video games and developing those games, it's important to look at the social aspects, because sometimes what we've seen is actually you can take a world that has been developed in, for instance, Italy, and you can do randomized trials. You can prove that world works equally effective in Korea, in Canada, in the US, in Italy. But there's other worlds that we need to really look at closely, like for eating disorders. If you treat a person in Saudi Arabia versus the US versus Italy, eating is a very social event, and it's very specific to cultures. So we are going to change the worlds, we are going to change the protocols. But I want to start with basically what I will say in the end, which is that video games have a great future. And if you're looking at that, there are positive things that outweigh the negatives in video games. I say this because I'm the editor-in-chief of a journal called Cyberpsychology, Behavior, and Social Networking, which is now in its 24th year. And we look at two aspects. We look at how virtual reality and video games and other advanced technologies are being used for training, education, treatment, and prevention. And we also look at the impact those technologies are having on both individuals and society as a whole. So I thank you again for the opportunity and look forward to our discussions.
Thank you, Dr. Brenda. That was very useful. And if I can move on to Dr. Ali, please, if you could introduce yourself and the same, give us your perspective on this whole subject.
Sure. Thank you, Mohammed. My name is Ali Carr-Chelman. I'm the Dean of the School of Education and Health Sciences. I've been in the educational technology space for over 30 years now and have designed jet fighter pilot training and done instructional design work for years. And about a decade or so ago now, I discovered the power of video gaming as an educational tool specifically. But it was less about discovering that video games could impart certain kinds of skills, which we have learned through our research over the last decade is definitely the case, 21st century learning skills in particular as an example, but more about recognizing that video games in schools had the potential to dramatically impact the culture of the school itself. And that was what became really interesting to me. So about a decade or so ago, I did a TED Talk that has gotten a bunch of attention about video gaming that specifically looks at the impact of adoption of video games in public schools or regular schools, however you want to think about them, and the purpose of that being a way to engage the disengaged learner. So they could be active learners. Many of them are boys. Not all of them are, but many of them are boys. And in the TED Talk, I sort of make the case that what we need is the world's best educational game. I've since changed my opinion about that significantly, and I've decided that what we ought to be doing is focusing on commercial off-the-shelf games as they currently exist, and us better understanding how those games serve the social milieu of the school and how they serve to change the culture of the school itself so that the schools are more welcoming to gamers, active learners, boys, and so forth. So that's essentially my thesis that I've been working on for the past decade or so, having a really great time with a number of doctoral students in my past that we've been doing that kind of research. So it's lovely to meet everyone, and thank you again for the invitation to join you here today.
Thank you. And if I can pass on to Benjamin, again, introduce yourself and your perspective, please.
Thank you, Mohammed. I'm Benjamin de Vienne. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Pipebagger. This is a cloud gaming social platform. You can check it out. It's a partner of Gamers Without Borders. Prior to this, I've been working in gaming and worked on over 20 social games at big companies like Ubisoft, Gameloft, and Electronic Arts. I also worked at Facebook, where I was leading analytics, and I was working with teams like social video, Facebook Watch, live video, a lot of different things around how do we consume media together. And I've also been working at Twitch, where I was the head of research, which was great. I could mix both my work on video games and also research, since I've been a guest lecturer and a lecturer in many different universities, including the University of Montreal and MIT. So I'm very excited to be here today. My thesis around, social and the power of social gaming is more an evolution of the way we interact with other people. What we observed, and I always think about this pretty ancient but interesting sociologist called Émile Durkheim, who was thinking about interaction between human beings, about being creators who interact through work and position themselves to work. What I've observed through my work is that a lot of people now interact and position themselves in society through entertainment and media and games and the way they consume it. And it's becoming a new way of expression that we should celebrate, and that comes with a lot of opportunities I hope we can discuss today.
Thank you. So it's obviously three different, very diverse dimensions, one from the health perspective, the second one from the educational dimension, and then of course from the gaming side itself, and particularly the social aspect of it and how this is becoming part of our everyday life. So let me maybe start with a question, if Dr. Brenda, you don't mind me. From a COVID perspective, it's affected everyone, and it's affected people. What are some of the things that technology can do to help, in your opinion?
Well, this is a great question to start with. And what we have seen both with the journal publications as well as in my private practice and in talking to colleagues is that everywhere in the world, we saw an increase in stress, anxiety, and depression. And part of this was because humans are social animals. We need to connect. And one of the beautiful things is that technology has allowed us to keep that connection during COVID. And for some of us that are a little older, that has been Zoom or video conferencing in some aspect. But the younger people are brilliant because they found a way to connect even more and to learn together and to do together. And this was partly in multi-user games. And you may say, well, they were just playing. No, they weren't playing. They were collaborating, they were learning, they were doing strategic, critical thinking. So this allowed them to, number one, escape in a way they hadn't been able to. So they got together with their friends just like they would have done at school. They learned pro-social behaviors. They learned empathy. They learned how to collaborate and to learn together by doing. And this was very, very powerful, especially for the younger generation. So I think we can't say, okay, let's not ever get together again. People love getting together. People are social animals. They want to be together. But it has allowed us to go into worlds and be with our friends and explore things together. There was a brilliant exhibit called Virtual Van Gogh. And it was his painting, Starry Night, which many of you may know. It's one of his famous paintings. And people were able to go into Virtual Van Gogh during COVID, and they were able to explore Van Gogh's painting. And it's exactly what we've seen in therapy over years, is when you go into an immersive video game, when you go into virtual reality, your reality is not my reality. You bring your own pieces, you fill in the pieces of that world, and you create your own reality. So for instance, if you have a fear of flying and I put you into a virtual airplane, you are going to start seeing a flight attendant maybe, or smelling coffee, and maybe I see something totally different. But you give that person the world, that container, and then they build upon it with their own imagination, their own subconscious, their own memories. And so it's a very powerful thing that we've been able to do this with technology during COVID. I think also it's very important. We've done some studies, and this again relates a little bit to COVID. We had a teen smoking world, and we were funded by the National Institute of Drug Abuse, NIH, in the US, to create a world to prevent teen smoking. It was running rampant in the late 90s and early 2000s. And we got together and we had all the subject matter experts. We had the programmers, the computer programmers, the artists, we had the psychologists, the researchers, the doctors, but we were lacking one thing. We were lacking that very important subject matter expert, which were the teen smokers. So we got them all together, held a focus group, and said, you tell us what you think would help your friends to not smoke. And the things they came up with made the world very, very rich. And so I think we need to understand that wisdom is good and knowledge is good and experience is good, but you've got to have that end user involved. And that's one of the powerful things that I think a lot of the young people that are thinking, what do I want to do with my career? They can go into health, they can go into gaming. It's all going to be used together to create some powerful experiences, whether it's training first responders, which we've done, whether it's doing educational tools, which we've done with autistic children and young adults, or whether it's training that phobia person to get over their fears. So I think technology basically has helped us during COVID to expand our worlds beyond just the shelter in place that we're in.
I love that, and particularly the takeaway that we really should be putting humans at the center of thinking our design and looking at it from that perspective, making sure that every stakeholder is involved in the process. I don't know, Dr. Ali, if you want to build on this, and Benjamin as well, happy for you to give your perspectives.
I would just add a little bit that, one of the things that I hear a lot when I talk about, so I was everybody's favorite teen mom. Like all of my kids' friends loved me because I was in favor of them playing video games. And so this was not something that was common among my mother peer group, right? But one of the things that would happen when I would talk about this out, in the speaking circuit was that people would say, but aren't you worried about the degradation of social skills? And I would say, I'm not at all worried about that, because you're just defining social skills in a different way than the modern teenager defines social skills. So they're being extremely social in these games, as I think Dr. Brenda is saying, right? So there's a lot of collaboration, there's a lot of communication. It's really quite impressive in terms of that. So I'm totally in agreement with what she's asserting there.
Perfect. And Benjamin, particularly, the point that I'm picking up is that, often people are looking at these games, for example, the gaming world as well, it's not the normal world. But as you know, nowadays, as more and more we become digital and we start to do everything in the online space, it is a normal world, or at least for a great proportion of the population, it is becoming a normal world. So your perspectives on obviously what already is being shared and at this particular point?
I think it's always good to look at data. And I think a lot of people don't realize it, but they are gamers. When you look, for instance, at Canada, in Canada, you have like 7 out of 10 adults playing video games in some form. And the average age for a gamer is almost like 38 years old. So they're not, teenagers necessarily playing video games, but we have so many new forms of games. Like, for instance, everybody have heard of Pokemon Go, which was, one new way to explore and interact with other people. That was a highly social game, even though it was not necessarily directly included day one in the game, but people were building a network around this and exchanging ideas and how to capture certain Pokemons. So I thought it was a very interesting experiment. The thing I kind of also liked about what was said is how people, especially younger folks, really use this technology to develop new skills, but also to develop their own personality. I think there is today a big idea around how do I project myself in the virtual space. And you may think of Instagram, for instance, and you have your self-reflection in the virtual worlds, and this is how people see you. And this is why we use filters. This is how we want to present ourselves. And I think it's also a good thing that people start to realize that this is how they're being seen. It's a very good skill to have, in the workplace, to know how to manage the way you behave in the social group. So I see this in a very positive light.
So that's very interesting that you mentioned that what you're saying in other words is that because of the skills you're achieving in playing these kind of games, especially in communal communities, you're developing skills which are needed as we become more and more digitized as society. So the workplace, or whether it is your entertainment areas, or whether it is even e-commerce and stuff, all of these skills are intertransferable.
For sure. And when people play, they tend to show a little bit more of their personality. As part of my recruiting process, and I hired probably over 400 people over my career, I would almost always spend at least 30 minutes playing a video game with the person. That was, proper, since I was working in the video game industry, but it's always a good way to see the different types of people. And there is a very interesting author named Bartle. And he talks about the different types of players you may find in the game. You have the killers, the achievers, the socializers, the explorers, and everybody is a little bit of all of this in certain proportion. And they tend to behave in a certain archetype when they interact through play with other human beings. And I think this is a great way to, offer a new way of communication.
We got a question from our audience, and particularly addressed to Dr. Brenda. Maybe you can reflect on this, and others can give some their perspectives as well. So I want to one day create a game. I'll read out the question. I want to one day create a game that is targeting social anxiety. I know we spoke about this at length before as well. However, how do you approach it in a way that it doesn't become another escaping game for the player, and rather send an awareness? And reason I want to do this is for my own past experience. So could you give your perspective? I know this is something that is very close to your heart.
Yes, and that's a great question. And we need people, again, that have experienced some of this anxiety to really understand what proper cues need put in the world. One thing I want to say is worlds or videos and all the technology is getting so sophisticated that we think we have to have something picture perfect and looking like real life. And that isn't always necessary or actually the best thing to start therapy with. So what we look at is maybe have something that begins not as realistic and then slowly rolled it up. So we call it cyberdose. So you may want to start with less realistic, more cartoonish, more animated, and then slowly dial it up to more real life. And you want to use scaffolding, which is also an educational technique. So you want to start with perhaps a few people in the world or no people in the world, practice your social skills, and then slowly ramp that up and have more distractions, more things that are not positive, like somebody saying, "What are you doing? Hurry up and order. I'm in a hurry." And having some almost a little bit of assertiveness or aggression in there to practice your skills. But to address it, that it's not just escaping, back in the late 90s, there was an online video game or online shared world called Digital Space. All you were avatar heads, but you had real life syncing of your emotions and your voice. And so you could show happiness, sadness, surprise, neutral, negativity, and you walked around these worlds. And so I would first teach some skill sets to people with social phobia. Then I would take them in this world and I would have them practice with me. We would both go in as an avatar. And we would go into these worlds with anonymity. We would practice those skills. And sometimes, for instance, they would go up to a group of people and the people would say, "Go away, this is a private conversation." So you understand that it's exactly like the real world. You can't just go into another person's conversation. And we would do that. We would then debrief afterwards. We would talk about what had happened in the virtual world. And then I would assign real world homework. And what we saw were the skills learned in that online virtual world and now in brick and mortar virtual worlds, those transfer over to this real world setting. So skills that you learn in the virtual world, they don't allow you to escape. They actually educate you and you learn and you translate those over and you change your behavior in the real world.
Thank you. Very useful indeed. Dr. Ali, can I ask you if there's anything you want to reflect or maybe add on this? If not, I have a question for you.
Yeah, I'm ready for the next question.
Okay, so one thing that we hear so much about is concerns with video gaming in schools, particularly around violent video games, addiction, distraction. And so there's a lot of critique around that as well. And you mentioned at the beginning the positivity about it. How do you answer the critique or the critiques who basically are talking about it from a negative perspective?
Yeah, so thank you for that. I think that there's a lot in the media about that sort of demonizes video gaming, and most of what you see in the media demonizing video gaming is not research or data based. It's just people's opinions or their sort of, it's my intuition that this is what's happening, or it's my gut feeling that something like that is going on. And so we don't really get a lot of, I think, real data about this, in fact. So in general, when people ask me about what are you, aren't you concerned about addiction? I say, well, not if a child's life is relatively well balanced. So that's something that goes beyond what's happening in the video gaming itself. It becomes a family kind of issue. So it is something that's real. We should be aware of it when we're in schools and we're using video games. We should be sure that we're on the lookout for addictive behaviors, and that we are helping that child become a full, whole, well-rounded person by encouraging them to engage in other kinds of related activities that might be of interest to them. Reading about video games, going to the library to play with the computer, thinking about learning how to code, things that may be of interest to them that take them a little bit beyond just being a consumer of the video game, for instance. So there are concerns about the addiction. We have to pay attention to that. I think the question about video game violence is one that has been really vastly misunderstood. There's a wonderful textbook or book called Misreading Masculinity that I would highly recommend. Understanding that violent, especially fantasy life, is a completely normal part of development for most young men, is something that I think is not always remembered by folks who are older, and often not understood by people who are women. So I think it's really important to understand that violence within the context of the development of the individual. And I think oftentimes we overlook that. So for me, I think that what's interesting is that in schools, when we talk about violent video gaming, there's an immediate pushback that we really shouldn't be allowing this in the school because it's violent. And Minecraft is perhaps one of the most easy targets in terms of this. Everybody loves Minecraft, but Minecraft EDU is not fun. And the reason why is because they eliminated the zombie pigs and sheep. Now we're talking about Lego block level of animation. But they didn't want zombies in there. And there was a big feeling among parents that we don't want to talk about what zombies mean. We don't want to have to address the religious overtones or non-overtones of zombieism. And it was just sort of taken to a degree that misses sort of the point of what's fun about the game in many ways. So if you ask kids, do they prefer to be playing an off-the-shelf video game, or do they prefer to be playing an educational game, they'll choose the off-the-shelf game every time, every single time. So human motivation being what it is, we need to pay attention to that and understand that for many, especially young men, the introduction of video gaming represents an important cultural moment, articulation moment in schools. So I don't know that that completely answers the question, but it's a good start anyway.
No, thank you. Very, very useful indeed. And I have a couple of follow-up questions on that, but I'll let Benjamin, maybe one first question I had in mind about was, you know, with social communities in gaming evolving so much, and the more I see and hear about sport, e-gaming, etc., the more I hear about communities. In your experience, you know, how has this enhanced the online gaming experience for gamers, but also how is it contributing towards wider benefits?
I think it's Brenda who said that, but we're social creators. So we're social animals. We want to be in a group, in a herd, and it feels good to belong. It feels good to belong to a group, to people who will think alike and really make us feel in a certain way. And I think part of being, you know, a gamer and being part of a gaming community, or even like a very large gaming community like Gamers Without Borders, like it's a big project around something. It helps us to federate around an idea. And what's very interesting with gaming is that it promotes micro communities, but also it promotes belonging to multiple communities. In real life, it's really hard just because of, you know, the physical world, time, or sometimes, you know, social pressure to belong to many different groups. In games, it's very easy for you to belong to many groups. And I think it's really important for a lot of like teenagers, but also like real life communities that may have problems, you know, in real life to, you know, interact or socialize. And thinking, for instance, about women. We see an increasing number of like gamers who are women. For instance, on Pipehacker, which is like a very social platform, we have 48% of the gamers who are women. or self-identified as women more precisely. And I think this is really important to create these spaces for people to experiment and to try to develop new skills, as we were like talking about, but also to, you know, hide their identity, role play. I think the role play part is a very important element of learning. If you want to learn something, you generally have two ways to do it: repetition or emotion. And through emotion, it's the way it's and role play, or like when you're a kid, doll play. I think this is a very good way for you to build your personality and to become just a better person overall.
And do you see the effect, like, you know, we as you said, humans are social animals. So if it's not in the physical space, it's in the virtual space. But at the core, it's about we wanting to be part of some social circles or communities. Do you see any change in this happening going forward, or do you see this becoming bigger over the years?
I think the current trend is going to continue. Like, more and more of our social life are going to be virtual. And this is not good, not bad. It's just a fact. We spend more and more like hours in front of a computer. Our work is also changing. Like, most of us is working in front of a computer most of the time. Most of us interact with colleagues through Slack or other, you know, chat systems. It's just the way the world is right now, and is continuing to be. And I think this is something we should also, and I'm thinking a lot about researchers, think about, because when you think about gaming, like for many years, probably between the 80s to the early 2000s, it was considered as something for kids, and everything was marketed as something for kids. When you think about the Game Boy, it's not the game girl or game man, game woman, it's Game Boy. It's something for kids. And I think this is something to be taken very seriously. You know, when I was working for one of the social media companies I mentioned earlier, when we're working on algorithm to anticipate and estimate if a influencer will be a good influencer in terms of audience, when you do not calibrate algorithm, they will tend to pick up what's easy. And in this case, it was to pick up like a specific gender and color of skin and physical appearance that was more appealing to a larger group, and it will over optimize on this. So I think this is something that, you know, we should accept that the world is becoming like more and more digital, that we are becoming social animals in the virtual space, but that we should also keep an eye and be extremely, you know, careful about how we proceed and how we build this together.
Absolutely. Returning, Dr. Brenda, to you again. You know, you mentioned earlier, and also when we were chatting a few times, you talked about how video gaming can be used, or games can be used from a treatment perspective and training. Can you elaborate a bit on, you know, how this is going to evolve over the years?
Sure, absolutely. So we started using off-the-shelf video games, like city driving was one of them, to treat patients with driving phobias, but also to treat people with post-traumatic stress. So this is how you can start to have a continuum of care from the office to the home or to the real life setting. A person that's had a very severe motor vehicle accident and has post-traumatic stress is not ready immediately to get back on the San Diego freeways. They are quite busy at times, and you can't control what happens. So if you can teach that person to do diaphragmatic breathing, for instance, so to control their physical reaction to the stress, if you can teach them how to control their thought processes, so what we call automatic thoughts and cognitive reframing, then you put them in that virtual world and you have them practice, gain their self-efficacy, their self-confidence, their self-confidence goes up, and then you have them slowly say, okay, get in your car and just drive around the block at your house. Get in your car and drive 5 minutes to the grocery store on back streets. And so you slowly and systematically get them to realize that they had an accident. It was very traumatic, and you need to process those emotions. But then you want to move beyond that and realize that there is always a possibility that that might happen again, but the probability is small. One specific example I'll give on that, and then I'll go to kind of the future of that, is I had a girl who had a very severe motor vehicle accident. She was on her way to college. Her father had taken off work to take her to college in another state. And another teen driver actually came in front of them. She had to stop very quickly. Her SUV rolled over several times, and she was upside down, hanging from her seatbelt for an hour while the jaws of life got her out of that vehicle. Her father was next to her, and he had been killed on impact. So she had to deal with the grief, the guilt of killing her father, which she did not kill her father, but she had to deal with all of that. When I put her into the virtual world, which became very real to her, all she did was put her hands on the steering wheel and cry. She couldn't turn on the gas. She couldn't go forward. But she had wanted, as her goal, it had been to just be able to go to her physical therapy appointments by herself without her mom taking her. But she then began to use driving as her me time. So she drove anytime, anywhere she wanted. She went back to college in another state. She got a job and is doing quite well. And this is a long-term follow-up I've done with her. So it's very powerful. We're also seeing this progress from a disease model to a prevention model. So with mobile apps, with video games, with the internet and telehealth, we're actually seeing people take these tools and we're giving them what I call responsibility. So the ability to respond and do self-care and self-help. And this is the wave, I think, that healthcare has been going. It started more in Europe than it did in the US, but we're now realizing here too, it, number one, increases quality of life in individuals. Number two, it lowers healthcare costs. And number three, when we do the integrated care, so putting mental health and physical health together, we see a lowering in, for instance, symptoms of heart disease, symptoms of obesity, symptoms of several diseases, because you have to treat the whole person. So I think this is the exciting thing, is that we can move the needle from disease to prevention with a lot of these tools. And I see that as the wave of the future. Also, with the costs going down, we're going to see more people able to implement the programs.
Great, and obviously we will see more and more hybrid models evolving, where we can leverage both of the powers of both of the worlds for the betterment of people. Dr. Ali, if I can come to you, you spoke about earlier the focus of culture in schools. That should be, we see that as probably the best value or benefit coming from this, rather than the conventional benefits that we think about in the classroom itself. Can you elaborate a bit more on that, and if you can share maybe an example of how this has manifested into a positive change in culture?
Sure. So there aren't a lot of schools right now that are undertaking opportunities to have especially violent video games at the elementary level, which is where we are losing most of the active learners that we lose. We lose them by third grade. Thinking about adopting video games at the high school is useful, but it's not necessarily going to change the culture. The place that we see the biggest cultural shift that is needed is actually at the elementary school level. And just as an example, one of the cultural things that a lot of people may not be aware of or realize is that the elementary schools are really very female-dominated spaces right now. So for active learners, whether they're boys or girls, this can be very a difficult space for them culturally to exist. They're not designed for active learners. They're designed for mostly girl compliant learners, I would say, but not entirely. I don't want to get too far down the gender, road there, because we see lots of, there's a lot more diversity in group than between groups. So we already know that. But what we see is that in places that have tried this kind of thing, there's a pretty significant re-engagement of populations who feel disenfranchised by the way that the school is set up. So a statistic that most of us may not be aware of is that somewhere between 93 and 94% in the United States currently of classroom teachers from preschool through 4th grade are women. So there's almost no men teaching at that level. That number is even more small when you look for any kind of diversity, racial diversity among that group, or socioeconomic diversity among that group. Those numbers go down even more. So for a young African-American boy in a classroom in a relatively impoverished neighborhood, he doesn't look at the school as a place that he belongs, because he doesn't see any role models of himself in and among the teachers. So the culture of the place is very uncomfortable for that child. For years, they live with that. In grades 1 and 2, they begin to learn how to read, and most of the stories are not very diverse. Most of the stories are about things like a girl and her horse. They're not very interesting stories. They're not usually nonfiction, and so forth. So it's a pretty significant, in my opinion anyway, a pretty significant cultural shift to try to get games, especially violent video games, into schools. We don't have to put violent video games into schools to make this shift. There are other ways that we can do it. Like we can have bouncy balls in every classroom from preschool through 2nd or 3rd grade. The exercise balls that ask you to do constant corrections. That's really good for active learners, and it's really hard for teachers, because all day long they're seeing kids bouncing up and down. It's just not what they're quite used to. But asking kids to sit in seats all day long is a really very difficult thing for them. And that's where the cultural shift comes. So for me, it's less about the particular content or getting a particular kind of game into schools, and more about asking us to take our kids where they are today and recognizing that our kids are going to differ from each other significantly. And so asking for our teachers and our school administrators and our parents and our legislators to understand that schools need to meet children where they are, I think is a really hard thing. But that's the conflict, that's the cultural conflict, the intractable nature of the culture of schools today. So I don't know whether that completely answers the question, but I think that for me, that's what's really interesting about using video games in schools, is the potential to dramatically leverage and shift the culture of the school.
And just to build on to that, if I look at from an educational perspective, are you seeing more use in games where there is competition amongst, in communities, or are you seeing more in where they're using it on their own?
So most of the things that we see, even in the more progressive spaces, are heavily narrative games and educational games, drill and practice that could be done better with actual flashcards with a real person, because when real people engage with you in your learning, you feel like somebody cares about your learning. So it actually can matter. We see a lot of flashcard type things that are educational games. We don't see a lot of competitive games. We don't see a lot of violent games. The few places that we see that are typically in libraries. And part of the reason for that is that schools have so much pressure on them, and teachers have so much pressure on them to produce results on tests, on standardized examinations, to demonstrate achievement of particular pieces of content that our culture has said everybody must know how to do this in Algebra 1 or what have you. By 4th grade, they have to read at this level. And so there's so much pressure on them to do that the classroom teacher has no time left in their day to either learn about gaming or utilize gaming. It's just not something that's very realistic. So we see the most innovative things happening in libraries today, actually, where there's they still have curricular pieces that they have to reach, but there's a little bit more ability to integrate the technology into the library experience. Great, thank you for that. We have a question from our audience, Najla. A few questions, actually, 3. I'm going to start with the last one because I think that's the most interesting one. And for everyone, if you can
do it as a quick fire round on this to get these 3 questions. So what is your advice to game designers, developers to look at when designing and developing games? So I start with you, Dr. Alif. So advice to game designers when they're looking to design or develop games. Any particular thoughts?
They don't need any advice from us. They have completely cracked the code of human motivation. Game designers understand what makes a good game work, so we should stay out of their way. What we need to recognize is what great games achieve in our young people. The learning, the grit, the perseverance, the followership, pattern recognition, all those things that they're getting out of the experience of gaming. But developers don't need us to tell them about that. They're doing a very fine job on their own, in my opinion.
Okay. Benjamin, from your perspective, I know you probably will have a very particular view on this because you are in the industry building games. So advice to designers and developers, what should they keep in mind when they're designing and developing games?
So I agree with what was said. I think, like, generally speaking, they do a very good job, and I'm not like, a game designer, but what I may say from what I've seen is that a lot of like successful game designers are really focusing on the lowest common denominator, making something extremely easy to adopt, use, and utilize, and then make this thing, easy to control but hard to master. And I think, like, for instance, Mario is a very good example of this. So Minecraft is even better. It's very easy to learn how to play
Rocket League, extremely easy to pick up and run with.
Some people create literally, computers inside Minecraft with redstone and like very complex schemes. And I think this is the idea here. I think, like, nowadays a successful game design, at least for my personal taste, is a game design that allows people to express themselves and to communicate with other people, whether it's directly or indirectly, but that, like, a design that becomes a medium. I think this is a good way to put it.
Thank you. Anything to add, Dr. Brenda?
Something very quickly is that one of the quotes from somebody that hires a lot of gamers and feels it's a good skill set to have in his employees is, gamers are the kind of people you give a set of instructions to and they'll figure it out. So kind of give them their mission, let them know who their audience is, and get out of their way.
Thank you. I like the second question. And Najla, thank you for putting these 3 questions. What can parents and educators do to increase the positive impact of games?
Sure, I suppose I can start. I think that there needs to be a high level of tolerance for what's going on. I think a lot of parents are like, oh, they're just sitting around gaming. There's like not an understanding of what this generation is doing with gaming. One of the best possible things that you could do as a parent is learn to game with your kids. Please play with them. When they were little, you played Tea Party with them, and that was pretty easy because you know what a tea party is supposed to be like, and you had to put on a tutu and you had to get dressed up, and you would drink, tea that was air coming out of cups that are very pretty. And that was, it was pretty accessible to you. You understood how to do that. It's much less accessible to sit down and play League of Legends or Smash Bros with your kids. It's just harder to do, but please do it. It's one of the most important things that you could do with your kids. So that I would say that one thing, play games with your kids.
I like the comment. That's what I keep telling my mom, even though I'm already 29. Love that. One question I had in mind, and I think it would be quite interesting for hearing your views. There are probably a lot of budding either innovators or entrepreneurs who are looking to possibly build games for whatever purpose it may be. They may have an educational angle to it, or there may be a health, or they could be just pure community purposes and fun purposes. From your own each perspectives, if you can give maybe like an idea, or what would you love someone to go and problem solve and build that you feel it doesn't exist today and could be an opportunity for someone to pick up and design and build. So if I start with yourself, Dr. Ali, from an education perspective, anything that you see as a gap and an opportunity for someone to think about?
I'm sorry, I don't quite understand. A gap in what now?
So is there an opportunity that you spot in your field from an education using games? Maybe there's something missing as a game or an idea that someone could pick up and look to think, to explore, to build, and maybe becomes a big hit or success.
Yeah. So I'll confess again, this is a little bit like the last question about how I would advise designers. I think in 2010, when I did the TED Talk, I was convinced that the best possible thing we could do would be to combine what we know from COTS games, off-the-shelf games, about human motivation, and combine that with what we know about learning and education. I've abandoned that project entirely. I don't think that that's the way for us to move ahead. I think that we need to take the games that we already have that are already teaching kids lots and lots of skills. People know this because there are a lot of really well-known organizations that are ready to hire people from off of leaderboards if they're doing really well at a particular game, because they know that they have the skills that they need. Communication, followership, leadership, grit, perseverance, all the kinds of things that we've been discovering in our research. Everything else can be learned in terms of content. So they aren't concerned about whether you have a degree. They're concerned about whether you have the skills, and those games can actually demonstrate that. So from my perspective, the games are already out there and they're doing a really good job. But I think my colleagues might have better answers than I have for this, because mine would be to say, I look to the leaders in the gaming industry, like my colleagues here today, to be able to direct us in that way. I'm not looking for the best educational game in the world, because I don't think kids will like it. I met, with Sid Meier at one point in time and asked him about this, and was like, yeah, I'm not about making a great educational game. I make great games. If they're educational, that's somebody else's business in a way, right? It's not really what they focus on. And I think that that's appropriate. That's the industry, and that's how the industry should behave.
Thank you. Maybe Benjamin, quickly to you on this.
Yeah. And I think this is a very interesting question. One thing we don't necessarily think about is accessibility, especially for people who don't have the equipment or even internet. We're very often thinking about this from a Western point of view, which is we have good internet most of the time. We have equipment to run these games. I think right now, one of the big challenges is how do we also allow the next 2 billion players who are maybe right now in Southeast Asia, Brazil, India, Africa, to access these games and to also create new opportunities for their people. And this is, I can talk about this because this is one thing we're trying to solve at PyPacker. We really try to rethink cloud gaming, but make it extremely accessible no matter what's your internet connection, or if you have a very old phone, it's going to work the same. It's not like, some more modern games that require a lot of things. So one advice for, entrepreneurs is try to fill this gap, try to fill the accessibility gap, and to serve the next 2 billion players.
Thank you. Dr. Brenda, anything to add on this?
Yes, and Benjamin gave me a good lead in. I started showing a slide in the late 90s in my PowerPoint slides, and it was on a universal platform. And I think we've seen that now with Netflix, Amazon, things like that. We've seen universal platforms, but one of the there's been 2 difficulties in healthcare. Number one, your equipment doesn't work with my equipment, doesn't work with the next person's equipment. So a clinician wanting to get started has a lot of difficulty doing this. It also makes it very difficult to put into electronic health records, or for a health system to put into clinical pathways. So we need something that is more agnostic in its ability to work with different technologies and different softwares. Number 2 is we need the training in place. And I sit on a board of a nonprofit that is accredited by the American Psychological Association, and we're trying to do that now. We've run trainings in 23 countries, teaching clinicians how to use technologies, because just like Dr. Ali said, with teachers not knowing how to use them, clinicians definitely don't know how to use the technologies well, and we need to remember they're just tools. We need to have good clinical skills, but then use them appropriately.
Thank you for that. We are getting close to closing time, but I've been told that we can continue for another 5 minutes or so. Can I maybe leave the floor open to you if there's any particular question you want to pose to a panel member that you felt from the conversation needs exploring further?
Yes, I would be curious to hear what my colleagues here think about VR and how it's also impacting, their work and their future research.
I'm happy to give a real quick 1-minute thought about that. Just that I've been to a number of VR conferences of late and think that there are some really good opportunities there for more immersive experiences. I'm interested in working on like lab schools that are interested in engaging in more VR spaces. There aren't very good VR spaces in most schools right now, so it's not something that we're adopting readily at the present. I think that they require a certain amount of funding that most of us don't have, and spaces that, so it's not just about getting VR into the school, but also about making sure that the school has sufficient spaces that are configured in the proper way. I'd really love to see kids creating VR in an ultimate kind of world. That would be an ideal, having a lab in most schools where kids could go in and not only experience, but they could create and design their own. I think that would be really exciting with, specific kinds of objects and things like that would be really nice. So that's my thinking about that. But I think it's, again, I think it's definitely related here. So.
Thank you.
Dr. Brenda, anything to add on that?
Yes, we actually were funded about 1.5 years ago to help children, adolescents, and young adults that were on the autism spectrum. And we actually had the adolescents and young adults that had coding skills come in and help us develop those worlds. So I think there's an opportunity to have people learn younger and younger coding skills, because it's becoming easier to code now in Unity and 3D and Maya, Studio Max, things like that. So I think having them learn that skill set, that may be a career they want to take, or it may just be them kind of giving back and being the subject matter experts with that. I also want to say 2 things. We were part of a funded study by the European Commission to prevent nurse and teacher burnout. I want people to think carefully about that, because we have a lot of healthcare workers as well as a lot of educators wanting to leave their disciplines now because of COVID and stresses. So think about how technology can be used for that. And finally, I put this in the chat box to Mohammed, but I developed a freely available online virtual world with my colleagues in Milan as a response to the stresses we were hearing about from COVID. And it's called The Secret Garden. There is a link that Mohammed will be sending after the conference, but you can download it. You can use it 360, looking around with just your mouse on your computer or on your phone, or you can get a very inexpensive head mount, such as a Google Cardboard. You can put it in that and go through a guided relaxation, which is in 12 languages. And again, that's just kind of our gift to the world to help with the stress and anxiety.
I believe my colleague has posted the link already, so that is in the chat if anyone wants to look at that. Let's go towards closing. There were other quite very interesting questions, but we are getting short of time. And I want to get each one of yours parting thoughts as we close. So if maybe I can start with you, Dr. Ali, if you can give me your parting thoughts.
Thank you. I'm so honored to have been with you today, and I have a hard stop at 1, so I'm going to have to depart after I say my closing words, but I'm so grateful to have been here. I think this was a great exchange, and I'm really impressed with what this organization is doing, and I'm really pleased to have been a part of it. I think that some of the exchanges around the social power of video gaming were really very exciting and interesting. It was really fun to hear from my colleagues and to hear the questions from the group. So again, I just thank you for the opportunity, and I hope that we all play more games. I think that would be good for all of us.
Thank you, Dr. Ali. I know you have a hard stop, and if you have to, please do feel free to move on. Dr. Brenda, if I can ask you for your parting thoughts, please.
Absolutely. I appreciate the opportunity to have been part of this today. I think it's a wonderful effort, and it brings us together in different cultures, different locations, in a way that maybe we couldn't before technology. I think games have a bright future, and I think they are a very good opportunity for younger people that are looking at a career, as well as if they look at a career in something else, using those games as part of their career. So thank you again for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you for being with us today. And Benjamin, to you, please, for your parting thoughts.
So Sim, for me, it was amazing to be here. Had a great time talking with you guys. One thing I'd like to say is that I hope this is just the beginning of the conversation. And, you know, for anybody listening to this, I'm pretty sure that myself and the colleagues here are easily findable on Twitter or LinkedIn or wherever. So, you know, feel free to reach out. And if you have like more questions, or if you have a very cool project in mind, I'm pretty sure we're all more than happy to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things I want to just whilst wrapping up, say that each one of us are doing this because of giving something back to the community. And this is itself a testament to the thought process that each one of you have and are trying to contribute in some shape or form your own knowledge and thoughts. You didn't have to give this time to us, but you did, which is really appreciated by all of us. And I want to also just thank our organizers of this. Really, first of all, Alanud from MCIT, really thank you very much for giving us this opportunity. She couldn't join us today in the beginning, but you're very much in our thoughts, and really thank you for this. It's a great initiative. Also, thank you, really, Think Tank team. You know, all the work that goes behind this is very easy. For us it seems very easy, but behind the scene there's so much hard work that goes into making these all happen. And of course MCIT, the Ministry of Communication and Information Technology in Saudi Arabia, really doing a fantastic job in doing these kind of initiatives to really inspire the youth of the future and give them some food for thought for what their careers could be about. And they want to very much encourage and build the digital economy and get the youth inspired to really contributing and wanting to be innovators of the future. And of course, Gamers Without Borders, last but not least, really great what is happening and how we are going across borders. And the whole gaming thing itself, you know, it tells us that we are breaking through boundaries of a national level to really work together and play together and build communities, which itself is an amazing opportunity. So thank you, everyone. With that, we'll close the session, and hopefully we will see you all again at some point in the future. There are a number of others which are happening in this series, so do join us for the next ones when we will be live. Thank you. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.